Bringing you news and information suppressed by the corporate-controlled media. This is Volcania Radio with Richie Allen.
His writing has often focused on the plight of the worst off children in the United States, and he's been published in many national journals, including the Journal of Professional Ethics, the Journal of Applied Developmental Psychology even, and the Journal of Social Distress and Homelessness. He is the co-author of America's Children, Triumph of Tragedy, which addressed the medical and developmental problems of some of the worst off children in the United States. He came to my attention a couple of years ago because he wrote a book called The Franklin Scandal, which is a story which a lot of people know about, but a lot of people don't know about, of a nationwide paedophile ring operating in the United States in the 1980s that were pandering children to a cabal of the rich and powerful. And the ringleaders of this paedophile ring, the pimps, as it were a pair of political power brokers who had access to the highest levels of the United States government. What a story it is. What a book it was, and I read it, and it's an absolute honour to welcome to Volcania Radio Nick Bryant. Nick, thanks for taking the call. How are you?
Not too bad. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. You're sounding great. You're in New York, of course, great city as it is. It's getting grim and dark and ugly and wet here in the northwest of England, Nick, but other than that, I'm doing well. Listen, when I rang you to ask you to talk to me again, you've been speaking to me a number of times on TV and radio over the last few years. One of the things you said was that you have a real eye on what's happening here with the investigation here, or maybe the lack of an investigation, into a paedophile ring operating out of Westminster in London. Do you want to say a couple of words on that, Nick, before we talk about what happened in America?
Yes, well, I've been following power broker pedophile networks for about 12 years now, and what is being uncovered with Jimmy Savile and other elites abusing children, that template has also occurred in the United States. It's occurred in Venezuela. It's occurred in Belgium. It's occurred in Portugal. It occurs in just about every country. Wherever there is elites and who abuse children, they seem to get away with it with impunity. Now, all people in social strata, whether they're rich or poor or middle income, abuse children. I mean, pedophiles exist in all social strata, but what we've noticed in our studies over the years is that there are a lot of elite pedophiles who abuse children with impunity. And you saw that with Jimmy Savile. He went to his death after molesting God knows how many children. And you also saw it with Cyril Smith. And I'm sure that there are many other power brokers in the UK who have molested children with impunity. The National Inquiry is coming up, and someone who was invited, who I know, who was invited to be part of the National Inquiry, wants nothing to do with it because she thinks it's going to be a cover-up of the pedophiles that are currently in power.
There's very little optimism amongst British people whom I speak to that this is going to be investigated properly, Nick. You just hinted at it there. I mean, when they appoint people like Baroness Butler Sloss, who has, a relationship, who has relationships with some of the people who may be accused, that tells you that, there are people who are going to do a hell of a lot to make sure that, what really happened doesn't come out. Just before we go on to talk about what happened in the United States, for our listeners, Nick just mentioned Cyril Smith there. We're going way back to 1983. When Geoffrey Dickens, who was a Conservative MP at the time, wrote a 40-page dossier and gave it to Leon Britton, who was then the Home Secretary of Great Britain, or the Secretary of State, as they're known in the United States, detailing child abusers within the British establishment, and it contains Cyril Smith's name. And we're now, 31 years later. Cyril Smith is dead, and Dickens is dead as well, Geoffrey Dickens. And we see people being appointed by this government to investigate these allegations, whom have ties to many of those who might be accused. So it's a disgusting situation, Nick, is what it is. Can we talk then about your amazing book, which is available to buy from all good bookshops, and we'll put links to it. I mean, it's incredible you writing that about everything that went on in the 1980s. And now it seems that, there are people who were abused, and there are family members of those who were abused trying to bring this out into the light now. And maybe they're going to, I think reading your book, The Franklin Scandal, is going to be of great benefit to anybody who was abused by a politician or by a member of the establishment. Let's go back to the 1980s. Let's talk about Larry King. Who was Larry King?
Lawrence E. King was a African American who was he was a high-flying Republican. There's two parties in the United States, the Democrats and the Republicans, and Lawrence E. King was a high-flying Republican. He was also the chairman of the Franklin Credit Union, which was a credit union is kind of like a bank, and it's designed to give, at least this credit union was designed to give loans to lower socioeconomic people.
Yeah, we have them here, yeah.
And ultimately what happened was a couple of kids came forward. One said that she had been flown around to New York and to Chicago. Lawrence King was centered in Omaha, Nebraska, and the Franklin Credit Union was centered in Omaha, Nebraska. The first child to come forward said that she'd been flown around and she'd attended pedophilic orgies in New York and also in Chicago. And she did name of a very powerful individual who attended these orgies. And then another kid came forward with a similar story. She said that she hadn't been flown anywhere, but she had attended a number of different orgies, and that included adults and children.
Now, who did these kids reveal those allegations to, Nick? Who did they tell?
The first kid told her foster mother what had happened. Her foster parents had basically pimped her out to Lawrence King and his pedophile network. And she told her foster parents, and her foster parents subsequently made contact with a youth worker at Boys Town, which is an orphanage in Omaha, Nebraska. It's a very famous orphanage because the foster mother reached out to the youth worker at Boys Town because the first kid that came forward said that there were also Boys Town students on the plane and also Boys Town students who attended the orgies, the pedophilic orgies. And then...
and they all named King, did they, Nick? Sorry to interrupt you. They all singled King out, didn't they?
Yes. Yeah. They said that...
They'd all met King.
They said that, and then another kid came forward and said that Lawrence E. King was the ringleader of pedophilic orgies that were going down in Omaha, Nebraska. Now, she was actually interviewed by the police. The first victim that came forward was not interviewed by the police. The police were cognizant of her, but no one interviewed her. The second kid that came forward was interviewed by the police, the Omaha Police Department, but then that investigation just stopped. And I should say that the Omaha Police Department had been investigating Lawrence E. King on child abuse charges previously, unrelated to those other two kids that came forward. So at this point, there's 3 documented cases of Lawrence E. King's name coming up with child sexual abuse. And absolutely nothing was done about it.
Now, this guy was, he was one of the most connected African-American men in the Republican Party at the time. He was on first-name terms with senior senators, senior congressmen and women, and even members of Ronald Reagan's administration. This is true, no?
And George Herbert Walker Bush's administration also. He was on a first-name basis with some of the most powerful elite people in the country. And I think that he pandered children to a number of those powerful elite individuals. So ultimately what happened was...
But you can't prove that, though. Sorry to jump in there, but for the lawyers, you think that he may have been giving children to some very, very, very powerful people, but there's no... to your credit, you haven't found any proof, just a lot of suspicion.
Well, here's the thing about that with naming. Like, some of the people that have come up in my investigation are mind-boggling. I mean, the positions of power that they've held and the amount of respect that they have, it would be very difficult to name them as child molesters because this system has a built-in safety protection mechanism. Because these kids that were preyed upon, if they performed well, they were given drugs. And they generally came from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, very dysfunctional backgrounds. So Lawrence E. King was taking these kids, and some of them were as young as 7 or 8, maybe, and he was flying them around, and they were getting repeatedly molested, and he was also turning them into drug addicts. So by the time these kids are like 16, 17, or 18, and they've lost their marketability, then they're just expunged from the network like gum that's lost its flavor and it's just spit out. So these kids who have been repeatedly molested and have been turned on to drug addicts go on and commit crimes and thereby compromise their own integrity. So it's very difficult when you have one of these kids or two of these kids that say I was molested by politician A or I was molested by cabinet member B. I have a tendency to believe them because I know that they were part of the network, and I also know that that they were flown to various locations. I mean I know that about them, but they've all had troubled pasts. So
and it's difficult, isn't it? It's an easy stick to beat a young kid with, to say, well, oh, you're only a drug addict, and you know you've committed petty crimes, which most drug addicts unfortunately have to do. So it was easy enough then to discredit these people. A couple of quick questions. Questions are flying in from the listeners. How was King able to get away with going through airports with children like that without anybody blowing the whistle?
Well, he was flying these kids around in private planes that he would charter, and I have like 200 of his flight receipts.
Yeah.
I was able to acquire all the evidence that was sealed by a grand jury, both the evidence and the testimony, which is illegal for me to publicize or publish. But I did anyway because I thought that what happened here was such a gross miscarriage of justice that I had no remorse about publishing what went on with the tainted grand jury. And but what's really interesting is generally there has to be a flight manifest where everybody on the plane has to be named. But in King's case, all the flight receipts that I have, there's no passenger manifest. So it just says Larry King +4, Larry King +5, Larry King +6.
And no names.
So he was able to manipulate a charter service to fly these kids around and without providing passenger manifests.
That's extraordinary, isn't it? As you said, I mean, when I first spoke to you some years ago, I looked into that, and that's just unheard of. You know, for the FAA and the authorities at the airports not to know who's on the planes, it's just unheard of. But you're quite right. You showed me the evidence, and the evidence is in your book. He was able to fly youngsters around the country, and nobody had a clue who was on the planes.
He flew children all around the country, but most of the receipts that I have go to Washington, D.C., and the kids would be flown to Washington, D.C., and Larry King, or Lawrence E. King's partner in this transcontinental pedophile network was a man named Craig Spence, who had a house in Washington, D.C. that was wired for audiovisual blackmail. And that I also prove in the book. And so a lot of these pedophilic orgies would happen at Craig Spence's house. And if you did anything illicit, you were undoubtedly compromised.
This is amazing. Now, can I just clarify that again in case our listeners didn't get that? Interfering with a child, interfering with anybody, sexual assault is disgusting in every sense of the word. There's no doubt about it. What Nick is saying there, and he uncovered evidence there, which is in the book, is that in some cases they were bringing people to this house to molest children so that they could hold the footage of that over the heads of those people to get them to do what they wanted, to vote a certain way, to do a certain thing. That's exactly what was going on.
Exactly. And anybody that did anything illicit in this house was compromised, whether they took illicit drugs. I mean, you didn't, if you wanted children, you would be provided with children, but if you wanted young males that were 18 or 19 or young females that were 18 or 19 or 20, you'd be provided with that too. If you wanted cocaine, you'd be provided with cocaine. If you wanted heroin, you'd be provided with heroin. Whatever you wanted would be there. Now, a lot of these parties at Craig Spence's house were just straight political functions, where a bunch of high-flying Washington, D.C. society types would be invited. They'd be from the presidential cabinet. They'd be from the Senate. They'd be from the House of Representatives. They'd be lobbyists. And the parties a lot of times would start out as just like straight political parties, cocktail parties in Washington, D.C. But then at like 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock or whatever, after the guests had been lubricated on alcohol, something would go down, like there would be some kind of explicit sexual act would go down, or someone would break out some cocaine or something. And people that wanted no part of that would leave, but people that stayed to partake of the goods would ultimately be compromised by Expense's hidden cameras.
Unbelievable.
And I've written a book called Confessions of a D.C. Madam that's coming out in March that is from the perspective of someone who provided escorts to Craig Spence and saw all his video equipment and basically was the subject of being blackmailed by Craig Spence himself.
Well, we'll definitely talk to you about that and promote that book when it comes out. Nick, talk to us about the efforts that were made to expose the network and to ultimately bring Spence and King and their co-conspirators to justice. Legislators in Nebraska tried to take them on. What happened?
Well, as I said earlier, there were 3 investigations into King molesting children or pandering children that came to naught. 3, 2 by the Omaha Police Department, and 1 supposedly conducted by Boys Town, the orphanage. And but then all this documentation ended up with, or some of this documentation ended up with the Foster Care Review Board, which is it's a state agency that looks after foster kids that are put into foster homes to make sure that they're not being abused or molested and that they're being treated well. This information went to the Foster Care Review Board, and they were very concerned about it because they had multiple sources that Lawrence King was flying kids around and molesting kids. So they went to the U.S. Attorney and also the Attorney General for the state of Nebraska. And they said that we think that we have a national child exploitation network that's operating here in Omaha, Nebraska. And they were expecting help from the U.S. Attorney for Omaha and also Nebraska's Attorney General, but nothing happened. Nothing happened. There was no investigation whatsoever.
And this goes to show, I suppose, again, the level of influence that King and Spence had, because they were obviously able to influence the local authorities, to turn a blind eye to the evidence being presented and basically not to open the investigation.
And I also have an account of a social worker who had a real bad feeling about one of the about the foster care home that the first kid came from, and she started to look into it, and she was told by the FBI to back away from it. And so the FBI comes into the story very early on as far as intimidating possible witnesses. So when this agency, the Foster Care Review Board, couldn't get the U.S. Attorney or the Department of Justice or the Nebraska Attorney General's office to investigate this, they went to some senators, Nebraska state senators, and now the Nebraska state senators were looking at Lawrence C. King because he had purloined millions of dollars from the Franklin Credit Union. So they were looking at him for that, but these youth workers went to the senators and said, the money is only half the story. That credit union is a front for a nationwide pedophile network.
Nick, can I just jump in there again? It's important again. I'm asking questions now that the listeners are Skyping in. This guy was unbelievably reckless, wasn't he? I mean, was he that convinced and was he that certain of his untouchable status? Or was he just a lunatic? Because when I read the book, I couldn't put the book down, The Franklin Scandal. I've read it 3 times. I don't have a copy of it at the moment because I've always given it to people to read. And, to learn that the guy was involved in financial misdealings and all of that, he either was certain of, as I said, his, infallibility, or he was just crazy. What do you reckon, Nick?
Well, he was a very depraved psychopathic pedophile. And he pandered children to extremely depraved psychopathic pedophiles. The reason why he wasn't investigated is because he was pandering children to the elite of the American establishment, the elite of the American establishment. So that gave him, and they were not about to go down. So they put pressure on investigative entities and corrupted investigative entities to make sure that Lawrence King was an untouchable. Lawrence King was truly untouchable by law enforcement until the Nebraska State Senate started investigating him.
Now, when the Nebraska State Senate started investigating King, people, and this has always been the case whenever something as massive as this is going down, people started disappearing, didn't they? And people started dying.
Yes, people started dying, people started committing suicide, and the Nebraska State Senate, the group of senators that was looking into this, hired a very good private investigator. His name was Gary Caradori, and he found additional victims that had been exploited by King, other than the earlier victims that had come forward through social services. He went and hit the streets and found 4 additional victims. So at this point, there's 6 victims of King's that have come forward and had made formal statements. And Gary Caradori really found himself under the gun when he started finding additional victims who were corroborating each other and corroborating earlier victims. The FBI started to follow him. His phones were tapped. He started to get threats. Senators, at least one senator on the committee started to get threats. A number of people were threatened. The FBI came in and started to really intimidate witnesses and victims. And that I have a tremendous amount of proof on. But Gary Caradori, he really believed in what he was doing. He saw that all these children had been destroyed with impunity. So he was going to really get to the bottom of this, and he had this Senate subcommittee behind him, the state Senate subcommittee behind him, which gave him subpoena power and provided him with the ability to make a lot of connections, and they were financing his investigation into this. And ultimately what happened with Gary Caradori is he acquired pictures of these pedophilic orgies in Chicago. And he was flying back from Chicago to Nebraska, and his plane just broke up in midair, exploded in midair. And Caradori died, of course, and the pictures that he had acquired. Now, I've got 5 sources that corroborate that Gary Caradori acquired pictures in Chicago. And
you know what, Nick? Even if we didn't believe that, and I do believe it, the fact that a guy who's been backed financially to investigate this, his plane just breaks apart mysteriously in the air. I've spoken about this with you before. Before I first spoke with you, I checked every single thing, and everything you've said is absolutely right. The guy died. The guy was on the verge of blowing it wide open. Nick, let's pause for 2 minutes, and let's take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll talk more. We've got about another 15 minutes then after that. I'm joined by the great Nick Bryant, a great author and journalist, who wrote about the Franklin scandal, a story of power brokers, child abuse and betrayal in the United States in the 1980s, where Lawrence C. King and others, Republican power brokers, people with access to the very highest levels of the Republican Party, were flying children, the worst of children, abandoned children, foster children, around the country to be abused by them and by other people like them. Unbelievable stuff. Quick break, back with more after that.
At Holland Hydroponics, you'll find a wide variety of hydroponic systems, accessories, plant nutrition and the latest hydroponic innovations, always in stock. Visit www.hydroponics.co.uk in May to find these fantastic offers. Holland Hydroponics, open in Manchester, Burnley, Huddersfield and our new store in Flint, North Wales.
The Nutter is at Wembley Arena, and I tell you this, control system, you ain't seen nothing.
The fascist global state is not coming because we're not having it anymore. No way, no more fear. We are all one. People are waking up. The beginning is here. Awaken.
A week on Saturday. It's a week on Saturday. We will be there. We'll see you there. The 25th of October. davidicke.com/tickets. Wayne Tarkin Smith on Twitter. How you doing, Wayne? Enjoyed listening to David Icke earlier on, he said, and he's bought a ticket for Wembley on the strength of hearing David. Thanks very much for that, Wayne. Welcome back. My guest this hour is the extraordinary Nick Bryant, the author of one of the most powerful and important books ever written about paedophilia in the United States, the Franklin scandal. Nick, we've got around about 12 minutes left. What became then of the investigation after the plane crash and the death of that man? What happened?
Well, there's a Chinese proverb that says, kill one man and silence thousands. And Gary Caradori's assassination was very, very public. And that, and a lot of people that had come forward, witnesses and also victims, had been threatened. Their lives had been threatened. And Lawrence King had told all the victims, if you ever talk, we're going to kill you. And so to see this very public assassination really frightened victims and witnesses alike, and they withdrew. And because Gary Caradori was a very public figure, and he was working for the Nebraska State Senate, so they felt if these guys were willing to assassinate Gary Caradori, they would certainly be willing to murder me. So a lot of witnesses and victims just retreated from coming forward and giving any more statements. And then there was a very corrupt state grand jury that found that there was absolutely no Lawrence King-related child abuse.
They said it was a hoax, didn't they, Nick?
They called it a carefully crafted hoax.
Hoax, that's right, yeah.
They didn't even name who the hoax was perpetrated by. It was, and I have all the testimony, or the vast majority of the testimony for that grand jury, and in the Franklin scandal, I show what a joke that grand jury is. I know that the grand jury systems are different from state to state, and the United States has a different grand jury system than most countries. In the United States grand jury system, a special prosecutor is chosen to prosecute a grand jury, and he and grand jurors are just people who have shown up for jury duty, and they've been funneled to a grand jury. Now, the special prosecutor is in a very special position to influence the minds of the grand jurors because he's the one that calls witnesses and chooses evidence. So only witnesses that he wants to call are called, and only evidence that he wants to show is shown. So there was a New York judge said that a special prosecutor has so much power over a grand jury that he could get special grand jurors to indict a ham sandwich. And in this situation, this grand jury was really a travesty of justice. And in my book, I show exactly how it was a travesty of justice, how it was choreographed to be a travesty of justice.
Absolutely.
And
there's no doubt about it. You leave no doubt about it in the book. What became then of this Larry King and Spence? What happened to these guys, Nick?
Lawrence E. King, Craig Spence committed suicide in Boston.
Of course he did.
And Lawrence E. King did about 10 years for embezzling $40 million from the Franklin Credit Union. But then he is out now, and he works at a BMW dealership near Washington, D.C. And 3 years ago, I came across a notice by a Granville Academy, which works with lower socioeconomic children, and the press release said that Lawrence E. King was affiliated with Granville Academy, and I just couldn't believe it. I was shocked that Lawrence E. King would stick his head up and affiliate himself with another brood of lower socioeconomic children, especially after my book had been published. So,
and you never received a phone call or a letter from any lawyer representing King to say, "We'll see you in court, Mr. Bryant. You've libelled my client." Never.
I never have, and I never will.
No, of course not. No.
Because Lawrence E. King is guilty of molesting or pandering God knows how many children, and I have the goods on him. Actually, I name a number of people in the book, and no one has sued me because, especially the government. I mean, I published sealed grand jury testimony, which makes me eligible for being arrested the day that book was published. I could have been arrested for publishing sealed grand jury testimony. But the government will not arrest me because the last thing the government wants to do is publicize my book. That's the last thing they want to do.
You had some guts to publish the book. Now, I know guys like you never see it like that. And I know guys like you are incredibly modest and very humble. And my experience of you over the years is that you are an amazingly humble man. But we talk about heroes. We use the word heroes. It's a nonsensical word now, thrown at anybody who gets on TV or does anything other a hero. You're a hero, Nick. I mean, to have the balls to put that book out there, knowing what it might do. And I know you've had hassle. I know nobody sued you, but I know you've had hassle over the years. You've had threats, you've had footsteps in the night, phone calls, and yet, you've persevered with it. You're a hero, mate.
Well, the thing about it is, I don't consider myself a hero. I just consider myself a guy who did the right thing. Children in the United States of America, actually children anywhere, but especially children in the United States of America, because it's the bellwether of supposedly our Western civilization, should not be abused with impunity. They should not be molested with impunity. State law enforcement, the FBI, the Department of Justice, should not cover up children that are being abused. And so I'd written a lot about lower socioeconomic children before I wrote the Franklin scandal. But I was of the conviction when I started writing it, and I'm still of the same conviction that children in America shouldn't be abused with impunity. Actually, children anywhere shouldn't be abused with impunity. But in this situation, the FBI and the Department of Justice knew that children were being abused, and they covered it up. And there's other cases of that in the United States. With Jeffrey Epstein is a recent case of a power broker who had lots of wealthy friends, and he was providing underage girls to his friends. And the Department of Justice was aware of at least 40 victims.
We're only at the tip of the iceberg, Nick, I think, globally. We've got about 3 minutes. I want to ask you a couple of quick questions. Importantly, what became of those children, Nick, those dozens and dozens of children who were horrifically abused like that? Do we know what happened to any of those kids?
Well, a lot of them are dead. A lot of them are trying to cut and paste lives together. There was a girl who refused to recant her abuse. Her name was Alicia Owen. And she took on the Department of Justice and FBI and also the state jury, too, or a state trial, too. And she was indicted on 8 counts of perjury for refusing to recant her abuse, and she was looking at 160 years of prison. And she fought tenaciously but she was ultimately convicted. And in the book, I just show how corrupt her trial was. It was as corrupt as that grand jury. And but she has put together a great life for herself. She's got a great job. She did 4.5 years in prison for that. And but since then, she's a college graduate, and she's got a wonderful husband. She's got a great job. She's got a wonderful life. And that's and that's the poetic justice in this. The kids that came forward and stuck to their story, there were actually 4 kids that came forward and stuck to their story, have been able to kind of cut and paste lives together for themselves. They're imperfect lives, but they're lives nonetheless. The kids that recanted their abuse one has died as a drug addict, and one is certainly en route of dying as a drug addict. And then I've interviewed a number of kids who were molested, who I had documentation on, because Gary Caragori compiled a list of like 60 victims, and I used that list to find other kids that never even came forward. And most of them are drug addicts and live very, very sorry lives. It's truly unfortunate.
It is terrible. And it is. I don't mean to sound flippant. It is terrible. I've had experience. I've not had personal experience of sexual abuse. I didn't have a good childhood at all, but I wasn't sexually abused. But I know friends of mine, kids that I grew up with who were, and I know what a difficult road it is to recover from it. Nick, finally, without naming any names, do you think it still goes on at the highest levels of power today?
I have no doubts about it. I was talking about Jeffrey Epstein a couple of minutes ago, and he's the latest of in a long line of pedophilic pimps who pander children to the rich and powerful. It's, as I said earlier, what you've got with Jimmy Savile in the UK. I'm sure that there are power elites molesting children in the UK right now with impunity, just as there are power elites in the United States molesting children with impunity right now. As I said earlier, people from all social strata and economic strata molest children, but it's the elites that do it with impunity.
Nick, I want to thank you for coming on again and telling that story. I want people to go to franklinscandal.com. You can read more about Nick, and there's links there on where to buy the book. I came across it on Trine Day. Check out Trine Day Media as well, and we'll give a link to it on our Facebook page. Nick, I hope that, as depressing as it is, and as completely unsure of the investigations here in Britain that most people are not optimistic that there'll be any real investigation, particularly with the British government appointing people who, had relationships with some of the people who would be accused. I like to think that your work and the work of others won't be in vain, and that these people will be brought to justice eventually. I want to thank you for coming on, mate, and we'll definitely talk again in advance of your next book coming out. Nick, thanks a lot.
Okay, have a great night, Richie.
Wake up and smell the coffee at volcaniainternational.com.